Okay, buckle up, time travelers, and welcome back to Lifespan, the wildest lives in history, unfiltered. Would you forget what you learned in school? This is history's unhinged side. Tonight, we're plunging headfirst into the autumn of 1888, right into the fog-choked alleys of Victorian London. Forget polite history lessons. We're embarking on a bizarre journey into a story so chilling, so baffling, so utterly drenched in blood and mystery, it feels ripped from the darkest fiction. We're talking about the Phantom Menace who haunted the East End, the faceless terror who carved his name into history with a blade, the ultimate unsolved enigma, Jack the Ripper.
Absolutely. And this isn't just, a true crime story. It's a historical black hole that swallowed careers, stoked massive societal panic. It birthed legends, and it still whispers questions we just can't answer, even over 130 years later. We're not just recounting events here. We're trying to understand the enduring impact of this whole case. Let's light a metaphorical gas lamp and descend into the madness, looking at why this story continues to fascinate and stir us so much.
So, to really get a grip on this bizarre journey, we've got to paint a picture of the setting, right? Because forget those quaint ideas of Victorian England. We're talking about Whitechapel in 1888, which for many people was, well, essentially hell on earth. Can you elaborate on just how grim things were and, why that matters to the story?
Grim is putting it mildly. Imagine a district choked by crushing poverty, a real warren of incredibly overcrowded slums known as rookeries. These weren't just poor neighborhoods. They were breeding grounds for disease, cholera, tuberculosis, you name it, and alcoholism and brutal crime were simply, well, part of daily life. It was a constant, desperate struggle just to survive. Picture a labyrinth of narrow, unlit streets where dozens of people might be crammed into a single, squalid room in one of the many lodging houses. This density, this lack of order, it created an environment where anonymity just thrived.
It sounds almost unimaginable by today's standards, and I know there was a lot of social tension simmering beneath the surface too, wasn't there?
Absolutely. Immigration was a huge factor. You had waves of Eastern European Jews fleeing persecution, Irish escaping famine, all pouring into the already bursting population of Whitechapel. This influx, sadly, fueled a really virulent strain of xenophobia and fear. And for women in this environment, well, prostitution wasn't really a choice in the way we might understand it today. For many, trapped in unimaginable poverty with few, if any, other options, it was a grim necessity, often just to secure a bed for the night. This wasn't just a backdrop, this oppressive, dangerous environment where women were so incredibly vulnerable. It really was a key element in understanding the context of these horrific crimes.
And then the murders begin. The level of terror in the East End must have been just palpable.
Volcanic is maybe the only way to describe it. Absolute terror, especially among the women living there. You saw the immediate formation of vigilante groups, the most famous being the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, led by a local builder named George Lusk. They took to patrolling the streets themselves, demanding action from the police, even hiring their own private detectives at one point. And this wasn't just local panic. The fear spread like wildfire throughout London, and very quickly it became international news. The whole world was watching Whitechapel.
And the media, it seems, played a huge role in shaping that narrative. It was almost like the birth of our modern true crime obsession, wasn't it?
Precisely. You could really argue this was the first modern media circus surrounding a serial killer. The burgeoning penny dreadfuls, these cheap, sensationalist newspapers, they just went into overdrive. Headlines screamed about the latest supposed developments. Lurid details, some real, many completely fabricated, were splashed across every page. And of course, the killer got his infamous moniker, Jack the Ripper, thanks to a taunting letter that was allegedly sent by him to the Central News Agency.
The Dear Boss letter, right?
Yeah. The one. Whether it was genuine or, as many suspect, a journalist's invention to sell papers, this media saturation amplified the fear massively and transformed Jack the Ripper into this terrifying, almost supernatural boogeyman in the public imagination. It also arguably set a precedent for how future serial killer cases would be covered, focusing on the macabre and the unknown.
And talk about pressure on the police. They must have been under an incredible microscope.
Oh, they were absolutely overwhelmed, and they faced intense public condemnation. Their investigative methods seemed archaic even for the time, relying heavily on eyewitnesses and poorly lit streets. Plus, there were constant jurisdictional clashes between the Metropolitan Police, responsible for most of London, including Whitechapel, and the smaller, separate City of London Police who covered the square mile, a crucial part of the Ripper's hunting ground.
That division must have caused problems.
Definitely. It hampered communication and coordination. The lack of progress in catching the killer fueled accusations of incompetence and public trust in law enforcement just plummeted. It really highlights the massive challenges of policing in a rapidly growing, complex city before modern forensic techniques existed.
And it wasn't long before the whispers started, was it? The theories about cover-ups and, who might be involved beyond just some random killer. Why did those conspiracy theories take hold so quickly?
Almost immediately. The intense fear and the sheer frustration at the police's inability to catch the killer created this fertile ground for speculation. And when you have something like the rapid erasure of that cryptic message found at the Golston Street crime scene, the graffito well, that really poured gasoline on the flames.
Right, the chalk message.
Exactly. People immediately started asking, was someone powerful being protected? Or was it maybe a clumsy attempt to prevent anti-Jewish riots given the apparent wording? These unanswered questions, these perceived inconsistencies, they naturally led to theories involving people in positions of power.
And the headlines themselves really paint a picture of the public hysteria. I mean, another horrible murder in Whitechapel, the reign of terror. And my personal favorite is a Whitechapel fiend, a maniac doctor. It's just wild how these narratives took shape.
They were wild, and they absolutely shaped how the public saw the killer. These sensational headlines fed the fear and cemented this terrifying image of a monstrous figure lurking in the shadows. But what's also significant, in a grim way, is how these horrific events forced a segment of wider Victorian society to actually confront the absolutely dreadful conditions in the East End. Suddenly, the suffering of the poor wasn't just an abstract statistic. It became the backdrop for this unspeakable horror. While social reform was slow and uneven, the Ripper murders did, arguably, contribute to a growing awareness of the deep inequalities within Victorian society and the urgent need for change.
And it's clear that Jack the Ripper isn't just some historical footnote. He's etched himself into our collective consciousness as, the first modern serial killer, hasn't he? What makes him such an enduring figure?
Absolutely. He's practically chapter one in the grim book of modern serial killers. He remains the world's most famous unsolved murderer. Just the name conjures up these vivid, almost theatrical images.
Yeah.
The fog, the gaslight, a shadowy figure, even though that iconic top hat and cloak look were largely a creation of the popular press and illustrators at the time.
Really? I always pictured the top hat.
Yeah, most contemporary descriptions were far more mundane. But he's become this potent cultural myth, a staple of dark tourism. You can still take Ripper tours in Whitechapel today, and he's kind of the yardstick against which so many other mysterious killers are measured. The simple, terrifying fact that he was never caught is a huge part of his enduring, terrifying legend. That lack of resolution just allows the mystery to persist and, evolve in our imaginations.
Okay, so now we're at the point everyone gets fascinated by who the hell was Jack. And this is where we really tumble down the rabbit hole, isn't it? The sheer number of suspects is just mind-boggling. Why so many? And why does it feel like everyone has their pet theory?
It truly is a rabbit hole. And you're right, the sheer number of proposed culprits, hundreds, literally hundreds over the years, is astounding. The lack of definitive physical evidence, the often contradictory eyewitness testimonies we mentioned, and just the profound horror of the crimes created this void that speculation just rushed in to fill. Because the case remains unsolved, there's this irresistible urge to piece together the fragments and offer a solution, And without concrete proof to definitively rule anyone out, the door remains wide open for endless theories, each with its own set of proponents and evidence, some stronger than others.
It speaks to our need for closure, I guess.
Exactly, especially in the face of such unsettling ambiguity.
So let's start with some of the more popular or contemporary suspects. Montague John Druitt keeps popping up. What's the core of the case against him?
Montague John Druitt. He was a barrister and a schoolteacher who tragically died by drowning, likely suicide, in the Thames shortly after the last of the generally accepted canonical murders, Mary Jane Kelly's, in late 1888. The timing of his death is certainly suspicious, right? He also came from a family with some medical connections, and there were reports, later notes really, suggesting some mental instability. So he fits a certain profile that some contemporary investigators, like Melville McNaughton in a private memo, considered plausible: an educated man, maybe with some medical knowledge, and a troubled mind.
But the evidence.
That's the thing. It's crucial to remember there's very little direct, hard evidence definitively linking him to the actual murders. The case against him is largely circumstantial, built almost entirely on the timeline of his death coinciding with the apparent end of the killings.
Okay. And then there's Aaron Kosminski. He seems to have gained more traction in recent years, especially with that DNA evidence from the shawl, right? What should we make of that?
Aaron Kosminski. He was a Polish-Jewish immigrant living in Whitechapel, and years later, police officials like McNaughton and former Chief Inspector Swanson privately noted him as a strong suspect. He suffered from severe mental illness diagnoses, included paranoid schizophrenia, auditory hallucinations, and he was eventually institutionalized in asylums for many years. The more recent DNA analysis, yes, focused on a shawl allegedly found near the body of Catherine Eddowes. This analysis did identify mitochondrial DNA sequences said to match descendants of both Kosminski and Eddowes.
So that sounds pretty convincing.
Well, here's the big but, and it's a point of significant debate within ripperology. The provenance of that shawl, its chain of custody over more than a century, is very unclear and disputed. And the methodology of the ancient DNA analysis itself, specifically mitochondrial DNA, which isn't unique like nuclear DNA, is hotly contested by many experts in the field. So, while this evidence has led many, including the researcher who published it, to believe Kosminski is the most likely candidate, the wider scientific and ripperologist community remains pretty divided on its reliability and interpretation. He's a strong contender for many, though.
Fair enough. What about Surin Kusowski, also known as George Chapman? He's another name I've seen mentioned, but he was a poisoner, which seems, well, quite different.
Surin Kusowski, yes, another Polish immigrant who lived in Whitechapel during the period of the murders. He later gained notoriety as George Chapman for systematically poisoning 3 of his common-law wives and was ultimately executed for those crimes. Interestingly, Chief Inspector Frederick Aberline, who was a key investigator on the ground during the Ripper case, reportedly told George Godley, the officer who arrested Chapman, that he favored Kusowski Chapman as the Ripper later in his life.
But the method?
Exactly. The modus operandi is this significant hurdle, as you say. The Ripper used a knife with brutal, almost surgical precision in the mutilations. Kusowski's method was the slow, insidious use of poison. These are very, very different methods of killing, which makes it difficult for many researchers to accept him as Jack the Ripper, despite Aberline's later suspicions.
And Michael Ostrog, he sounds like a character ripped from a Penny Dreadful himself.
He certainly does have that kind of theatrical air about him. Michael Ostrog was a Russian-born con man and thief with a documented history of bizarre behavior, multiple aliases, and periods of confinement in asylums. He even made outlandish claims about being a former surgeon in the Russian Navy. The main problem with Ostrog as a viable Ripper suspect lies in historical records. They strongly suggest he was actually imprisoned in France during the autumn of 1888 when the Whitechapel murders were taking place. So while his profile might seem to fit a certain image of a deranged individual, the timeline just doesn't really work out.
Right, alibi issues. And we can't forget Leather Apron, the early suspect who really tapped into the anti-immigrant anxieties of the time.
Exactly. Leather Apron was the sensational nickname the press gave to John Pizer, a local Jewish bootmaker in Whitechapel. He became an early focus of intense suspicion, fueled largely by the prevalent anti-Semitic sentiment and some vague rumors about him intimidating or extorting money from local prostitutes. However, Pizer had verifiable alibis for the times of the first 2 murders, and the police quickly cleared him after bringing him in for questioning. Despite this, the unsettling nickname and the underlying prejudices it reflected lingered in early media coverage and certainly contributed to the atmosphere of fear and suspicion directed towards the immigrant community.
Okay, so those are some of the more grounded, shall we say, suspects. But then we get into the truly outlandish, starting with Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's own grandson. Why does this theory persist despite seeming so, well, improbable?
Ah, yes, Prince Albert Victor, or Eddie, Duke of Clarence. This is where the realms of historical speculation and, frankly, outright fantasy often collide. Rumors circulated, mostly decades later, painting him as suffering from syphilis-induced madness or claiming he secretly visited prostitutes in Whitechapel. The really elaborate royal conspiracy theory weaves into this complex plot where the murders were orchestrated, perhaps by royal physician Sir William Gull and others, to silence prostitutes who were supposedly blackmailing the prince over a secret marriage or illegitimate child.
That sounds like a movie plot.
It pretty much is. Now, while it makes for a compellingly scandalous narrative, it's almost universally dismissed by serious historians and Ripper researchers. Eddie's documented whereabouts during the murders simply don't align with the timeline. He was often hundreds of miles away, sometimes at Balmoral with the Queen. There is absolutely zero credible evidence to support any of these claims. Its enduring popularity likely stems purely from its sensational nature. The idea that a member of the royal family could be this brutal killer is inherently captivating, Regardless of the factual basis, it's pure, delicious scandal-mongering that has just taken on a life of its own.
Got it. Pure speculation. And what about the artist Walter Sickert? His name seems to come up quite a bit in more recent discussions.
Walter Sickert. Yes, he was a well-regarded artist, known for his often dark and atmospheric depictions of urban life in London, including some quite gritty scenes of the East End and its inhabitants. Crime novelist Patricia Cornwell famously invested a considerable amount of her own money and effort trying to prove he was Jack the Ripper. She cited what she believed were hidden clues and confessions within his artwork, handwriting analysis, and some very controversial DNA evidence linked to stamps on letters supposedly sent by the killer or Sickert himself.
And the verdict on that?
The vast majority of established ripperologists find her evidence to be extremely circumstantial, often based on subjective interpretations of his art, and ultimately unconvincing. The DNA evidence in particular has faced significant criticism regarding methodology and potential contamination. While Sickert's fascination with the macabre and his artistic subjects certainly create an intriguing link for some, the direct evidence connecting him to the crimes remains, well, flimsy at best.
Then we have Lewis Carroll, the beloved author of Alice in Wonderland. That one always struck me as particularly out there.
Lewis Carroll. Yes, this theory posits that the gentle author Charles Dodgson harbored a dark secret, and that hidden anagrams within his famous children's books supposedly point to him as the Ripper. It's a theory considered utterly ludicrous by pretty much everyone in the field except for the person who originated it. It definitely resides firmly in the gloriously unhinged category of ripperology, no evidence whatsoever.
Okay, good to know. And let's not forget the intriguing, if ultimately unsubstantiated, idea of Jill the Ripper, a female killer.
The Jill the Ripper theories are interesting. They propose that the killer was actually a woman, perhaps a midwife, who would have anatomical knowledge and wouldn't arouse suspicion being seen with blood on her clothes in the aftermath of the crimes. Or maybe someone driven by revenge against prostitutes, or suffering from some kind of mania. It's an intriguing concept because it challenges the traditional assumption of a male serial killer, and opens up different possibilities regarding motive and opportunity, especially how the killer might have approached the victims without immediate alarm.
But any actual suspects?
Despite its interesting premise, there are currently no credible female suspects who fit the profile or the timeline, and there's no solid evidence to support the idea of a female Ripper. It remains largely speculative.
It's just astonishing how many different theories there are. What do you think truly fuels this relentless and, frankly, enduring hunt for Jack's real identity, even after all this time?
Well, I think the Ripper's complete anonymity is absolutely central to this enduring fascination. Because he was never definitively identified and apprehended, it leaves this huge open space, this void, where endless speculation can just flourish. Then you've got the intensely atmospheric Victorian setting, the fog-shrouded streets, the gaslight. It adds so much to the mystique, doesn't it? The sheer brutality and the transgressive nature of the crimes continue to shock and demand some kind of explanation. And there's that powerful, almost mythical image of the phantom killer who appeared from the fog, committed these horrific acts, maybe taunted the police, and then just vanished without a trace. Plus, the Ripper has become such a foundational archetype for fictional serial killers in modern literature and film, constantly being referenced and reinterpreted.
So the lack of an answer keeps it alive.
Absolutely. And the fact that any theory, no matter how outlandish, can gain some level of traction in the absence of definitive proof, just keeps the debate going. Ultimately, it's a combination of the unsolved mystery, the historical context, the shocking nature of the crimes, and our innate human desire to solve a puzzle, especially one this dark, that continues to drive this relentless pursuit of Jack the Ripper's true identity.
It's clear that Jack the Ripper's impact went far beyond the immediate terror in Whitechapel. He cast such a long shadow over our culture. He basically spawned a whole subgenre, didn't he?
He absolutely did. Jack the Ripper didn't just commit a series of horrific murders. He inadvertently launched a massive cultural phenomenon. In literature, the Ripper has inspired countless novels, from meticulously researched historical fiction to wildly imaginative thrillers. Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell's graphic novel From Hell is a particularly notable example. A really dark, complex interpretation woven around that royal conspiracy theory we talked about. Then you have film and television, numerous adaptations, Sherlock Holmes encountering the Ripper, countless horror films drawing inspiration from his crimes, and various TV series exploring the mystery.
Even music.
Even music. Artists across different genres, from metal bands like Motorhead and Judas Priest to artists like Nick Cave, have referenced him in their work. And he's even become a character, or at least a presence, in video games like Assassin's Creed Syndicate. It just shows his pervasive presence in popular culture.
And there's this whole dedicated community of people still trying to solve the case, right? Ripperology. What exactly is that?
Yes, ripperology. It's essentially a dedicated field of study, though largely existing outside of traditional academic institutions. It's a fascinating, sometimes slightly obsessive cottage industry. It's comprised of amateur and professional researchers, authors, tour guides, and just enthusiastic members of the public who are all dedicated to examining every single aspect of the case, from the victims' lives and backgrounds to the tiniest details of police procedure to debating the latest suspect theories. They have their own specialist books, journals, sometimes conferences, and very active online communities where they debate evidence, analyze historical documents, and propose new interpretations. It's a very active scene.
It's also interesting how the Ripper investigation, despite its ultimate failure to catch the killer, inadvertently highlighted some of the real limitations of policing back then.
It really did. The investigation into the Ripper murders brutally exposed how ill-equipped Victorian law enforcement really was to handle such a complex and frankly unprecedented case. They lacked so many of the fundamental forensic techniques that we just take for granted today. Fingerprinting was still in its absolute infancy and not really used systematically, and DNA analysis was, decades and decades away. Communication and coordination between different police forces, as we mentioned, were often poor, and they struggled with basic crime scene management. Scenes were often crowded with onlookers before police secured them, leading to potential contamination or destruction of evidence. So they relied mostly on witnesses, heavily reliant on often unreliable eyewitness accounts, yeah. And they lacked the sophisticated data analysis tools or centralized crime databases we have now. While the Ripper case didn't instantly revolutionize policing overnight, it certainly contributed to a growing awareness of these shortcomings and fueled the long-term push for more scientific methods, better interforce cooperation, and centralized record-keeping.
So, after all this time looking back at everything, why do you think we're still so deeply obsessed with Jack the Ripper? What is it about this particular case that continues to captivate and, disturb us?
I think it's a real confluence of factors that creates this perfect storm of morbid fascination. The most significant is, of course, the enduring mystery, that fundamental, unanswered question of who was he? It just hangs there.
Yeah.
Then you have that incredibly atmospheric, almost romanticized backdrop of gaslit, foggy Victorian London. It's a setting that lends itself perfectly to tales of darkness and intrigue, doesn't it?
It really does.
The shocking brutality of the crimes, particularly the mutilations, transgress the social norms of the time in a way that still feels deeply unsettling today. And then there's that chilling, almost spectral image of the killer who seemed to just materialize from the shadows, commit these horrific acts, and then vanish back into the fog, never to be definitively identified. Plus, as we discuss, the Ripper has become such a foundational figure in our understanding and portrayal of serial killers in fiction, and the whole dark tourism industry related to the case continues to thrive. The passionate debates online and in print show that this case still sparks intense interest and a real desire for resolution. He remains this dark touchstone for exploring themes of poverty, misogyny, media sensationalism, and the absolute darkest aspects of human nature.
Now, for those listening who really want to impress their friends with some deeper knowledge, let's delve into some of the more specific trivia and perhaps some of the lesser-known details of the case, the real deep cuts.
Absolutely. Happy to. First, it's important to understand the concept of the canonical 5 victims. That's Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. These are the 5 murders that most researchers agree were definitively the work of the same killer, happening between August and November of 1888. This consensus is based mainly on the similarities in the location, the time frame, and crucially, the nature of their injuries, specifically the throat cutting and the abdominal mutilations. What's particularly disturbing when you look at them in sequence is the clear escalation of brutality throughout these 5 killings. It culminates in the almost unimaginable level of mutilation inflicted on Mary Jane Kelly, which took place indoors in her own room. The sheer horror of that scene reportedly had a lasting psychological impact even on the hardened police officers and the doctor who witnessed it.
And then there are the infamous letters that were supposedly sent by the killer, most famously the Dear Boss letter. What's the significance of these and how seriously should we take them?
Yes, the letters, hundreds, literally hundreds of letters claiming to be from Jack the Ripper, flooded the police and newspapers during the autumn of 1888. The vast majority of these are now considered, almost certainly, to be hoaxes, cruel pranks, or attempts by journalists to stir up publicity. However, 3 letters, or maybe 2 letters and a postcard, stand out for various reasons. The Dear Boss letter, as you mentioned, is particularly significant because it's the first recorded instance of the name Jack the Ripper being used. It was received by the Central News Agency on September 27th. Many believe this name was actually coined by a journalist working there to add to the sensationalism and sell more papers.
So maybe not from the killer at all.
It's heavily debated. Then there's the Saucy Jackie postcard, received shortly after Dear Boss. It's notable because it referenced the double event, the simultaneous murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes on the same night possibly before those details were widely known to the public, lending it a degree of credibility in the eyes of some. It also chillingly mentioned clipping off the ears, and part of Eddowes' ear was indeed severed. And then there's the really gruesome From Hell letter. This was sent directly to George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, in mid-October. It arrived with a small box containing half of a human kidney, preserved in alcohol.
A kidney? Seriously?
Yes, the author claimed to have fried and eaten the other half. Given that Catherine Eddowes had her left kidney removed by the killer, this letter is considered by many, including some police officials at the time, to be the most likely to be genuine. However, even its authenticity remains a subject of intense debate, particularly regarding whether the kidney was indeed human, and specifically from Eddowes.
Wow. And we can't forget the incredibly cryptic Golston Street graffito. You mentioned it earlier, the message on the wall. What do we know about that?
The Golston Street graffito is a truly fascinating and endlessly debated piece of the puzzle. It was a message scrawled in chalk on the black brick fascia of an entryway in Golston Street, near where a bloodied piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron was found shortly after her murder in the early hours of September 30th. The message reportedly read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Now, Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren arrived on the scene and, fearing that the message could spark anti-Semitic riots in the already tense East End, immediately ordered it to be washed away before it could be properly photographed.
A controversial decision.
Hugely controversial. It's been heavily criticized by ripperologists ever since as potential destruction of evidence. The unusual spelling of Jews has led to a multitude of interpretations. Was it simply a misspelling by an illiterate person? Was it a deliberate attempt to frame the Jewish community? Some have even suggested it was a coded reference to Freemasons, linking Jews to figures from Masonic lore. The meaning of the graffito and Warren's swift action to erase it have fueled countless conspiracy theories and remain a key point of contention among researchers.
It's also striking how wildly different the eyewitness accounts of the killer's appearance were. It makes you wonder how reliable any of them truly were.
Absolutely. The witness testimonies regarding the killer's appearance were notoriously vague, inconsistent, and often completely contradictory. Estimates of his height, age, build, whether he had a mustache or beard, and even the type of clothing he wore, sometimes a dark coat, sometimes tweed, maybe a deerstalker hat, maybe a different type of cap, varied dramatically from one account to another. You have to remember the incredibly poor lighting conditions in the dimly gaslit streets and alleys of Whitechapel at night, the fleeting glimpses people likely got of the perpetrator, often under stressful circumstances, and the overwhelming atmosphere of panic and fear. All of this contributed to making reliable identification virtually impossible. It really underscores the inherent unreliability of eyewitness testimony, especially in highly stressful situations like these.
And the night of the double event, the murders of Stride and Eddowes sounds particularly chaotic and terrifying, happening in such quick succession in different jurisdictions.
The night of September 30th, 1888, was indeed a night of unimaginable horror and confusion. Within a very short time frame, probably less than an hour, two women, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, were brutally murdered in separate locations, maybe only about a 15-minute walk apart. What's particularly interesting, or perhaps perplexing, about Stride's murder in Berner Street is that while her throat was savagely cut, her body lacked the extensive abdominal mutilations seen in the other canonical victims. This has led to widespread speculation that the killer might have been interrupted, perhaps by someone entering the yard where her body was found, before he could complete his gruesome work.
And Eddowes was found soon after.
Yes. Catherine Eddowes was murdered less than an hour later in Mitre Square. Crucially, Mitre Square falls within the jurisdiction of the City of London Police, whereas Berner Street and the locations of the other canonical killings were in the Metropolitan Police District. Her mutilations were particularly savage, including the removal of her left kidney and part of her uterus. This double event not only intensified the public panic to fever pitch, but also highlighted the killer's chilling audacity and, again, those jurisdictional complexities facing the investigators.
And the fact that the murders occurred in these separate police jurisdictions must have added another layer of complexity, right? A real headache for the investigation.
It absolutely did. The jurisdictional boundaries between the much larger Metropolitan Police Force and the smaller independent City of London Police definitely hindered the investigation to some extent. There wasn't always the seamless flow of information and cooperation that was desperately needed in such a fast-moving and high-profile case. Having Edo's murder fall within the city's square mile brought a whole other police force with its own command structure and procedures directly into the mix alongside the men. At times, their differing priorities and, perhaps, rivalries likely created more confusion and duplication of effort rather than streamlined progress. It was another major hurdle.
You've really brought this dark chapter of history to life, the horror and the confusion. Are there any particularly striking quotes from the time that really stick with you and encapsulate that horror?
There are a few that offer a chilling glimpse into the reality of those times. Police Constable Watkins's very matter-of-fact description given at the inquest of discovering Catherine Eddowes is starkly horrifying in its simplicity. There was a woman lying on her back, her throat was cut, her clothes were thrown up, I saw her intestines were torn out. It's just a raw, unfiltered look at the brutality he encountered. And then, regardless of its authenticity, whether it was the killer or a hoaxer, the chilling excerpt from the Dear Boss letter is equally unsettling in its tone. I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. I love my work and want to start again. It's just this cold, boastful, and utterly terrifying declaration that sent shockwaves through London.
Chilling stuff. Okay, for anyone listening who feels compelled to delve even deeper into this bizarre journey, you've compiled a fantastic list of resources. Where should they start if they really want to learn more and maybe form their own theories?
Absolutely. For anyone who wants to embark on their own exploration of this endlessly fascinating case, the single most comprehensive online resource, without a doubt, is Casebook, Jack the Ripper. You can find it at casebook.org. It's an absolutely indispensable website, really. It's packed with exhaustive information on the victims, all the major and minor suspects, the police investigation, the letters, the locations with maps and photos, historical photographs, transcripts of original documents, detailed articles by leading researchers, and incredibly active forums where enthusiasts from around the world discuss every minute detail of the case. That's truly the starting point for anyone serious about learning more.
What about original documents? Can people access those?
For those interested in examining primary source material, the National Archives, UK, located in Kew, hold the original Metropolitan Police files, and the MPO files, and other relevant government documents related to the case. You can find their website at nationalarchives.gov.uk. Navigating them can be a bit of a task if you're not used to archival research, but many key documents have been digitized and are actually accessible through the Casebook website and other online archives, making it much easier for people to see the original reports and memos.
And what about recommendations for books for further reading? There are so many out there, it can be overwhelming to know where to begin.
You're absolutely right. There's a vast library of books on Jack the Ripper, ranging from serious historical analysis to wild speculation. For a comprehensive and well-regarded overview, The Complete Jack the Ripper by Donald Rumbelow is a classic. It's frequently updated, and Rumbelow was a former City of London police officer and a longtime Ripper tour guide, so he knew the streets and the case intimately. Jack the Ripper. The Facts by Paul Begg is another highly detailed and meticulously researched account that does a good job of separating the established evidence from the later myths and speculation. For a really powerful and moving perspective that shifts the focus back to the victims themselves, giving them back their stories and humanity, The Five, The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper by Hallie Rubenhold is absolutely essential reading. It won the Bailey Gifford Prize and really changed the conversation around the case.
That sounds important. Any others?
And for a fictional but incredibly atmospheric and thought-provoking take on the story, delving into the conspiracy theories but also the social context, I'd still highly recommend Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell's graphic novel From Hell. It's a dense, dark masterpiece.
Okay, great recommendations. And for those who prefer to watch or listen to their information, any documentary or podcast recommendations?
Sure. If you're looking for documentaries, a simple search on YouTube for Jack the Ripper documentary will yield a plethora of results. I'd recommend looking for productions from reputable sources like the History Channel, the BBC, or PBS, as they tend to be better researched. Be a bit discerning, though, as some documentaries can lean heavily towards sensationalism or present certain theories as established fact without sufficient evidence. You can also find some excellent video essays by independent researchers online that delve into specific aspects of the case very well.
And podcasts.
As for podcasts, while there isn't one single definitive podcast solely dedicated to Jack the Ripper that I'm aware of covering it continuously, the True Crime Podcast, last podcast on the left, did a multi-part, very deep dive into the case, offering their signature blend of dark humor and extensive research. You might also find relevant episodes covering the Ripper within the archives of other well-regarded history and true crime podcasts like Unresolved, Lore, Stuff You Missed in History Class, and Criminal. They often touch upon historical true crime cases. Finally, if you're interested in engaging with other enthusiasts and researchers, the forums on the Casebook website are probably the most knowledgeable and active online community. You can also find lively discussions and sometimes heated debates on Reddit's Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Just be prepared for a wide range of opinions and theories.
So there you have it. Jack the Ripper, not just a brutal killer operating in the shadows, but a dark stain on history, a cultural phenomenon that continues to fascinate and, yes, disturb us immensely. He emerged from the fog, committed unspeakable acts, taunted the authorities perhaps, and then just vanished back into the shadows, leaving behind a legacy of terror and an enduring mystery that simply refuses to be solved.
And that brings us right back to the central, haunting question that still lingers over 130 years later, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Was he a mad doctor with surgical skill? A crazed immigrant venting his frustrations? A rejected lover seeking revenge? A member of the aristocracy hidden by a conspiracy? Or simply an anonymous, deeply disturbed individual swallowed back up by the grim anonymity of Whitechapel, never to be known? The truth is, we may never definitively know. And perhaps that very uncertainty, that void where the answer should be, is the most chilling aspect of all.
This has been Lifespan, the weekly podcast that digs up the dirt on the most outrageous, chaotic, and downright WTF lived ever lived. Share, rate, and follow the show for more wild stories. Keep digging, keep questioning, and remember, history is weirder, wilder, and way more WTF than you think. See you next time.